Thank you for coming back. My name is Åsa Rennemo. I'm the professor in the geography department, and it's my honor to present the next speaker of today's event, Ellen Mosley-Thompson. Ellen got her PhD from the Ohio State University, and since then has been working there as a researcher and then as part of the as a professor in the Department of Geography. She is also the director of the Bird, Polar, and Climate Research Center, and she's been a director for what, 8 years now, and leading that fine institution. She's actually a distinguished professor at the Ohio State University, and like our previous speaker, Ellen has there's so much excellence in her career and awards and fellowships and all kinds of things. I don't know where to start, so I'll just mention a couple of the very prestigious things that she has accomplished and things of note from about Ellen. For example, she is also a member of the National Academy of Science. She's a fellow of the American Geophysical Union, and she too has been awarded many prizes and so on. I think perhaps the most amazing award or recognition is the fact that there is a place in Antarctica that is named after Ellen Mosley-Thompson. So that's pretty amazing. And that is, I assume, in recognition of all the work that you've done on that continent. Ellen has led 9 expeditions to Antarctica and 6 to Greenland. And on a personal note, this is particularly amazing for me. I've met Ellen many times through my career, and before I became a professor and when I was a postdoctoral student and so on, where I met Ellen at workshops for early career scientists. And she's always been extremely supportive of early career scientists and generous with mentoring and advice, not just for me, but for many of us trying to make a career as polar scientists. So very much appreciate all that support through the year. And right now I'm leading a research project where we're actually, one of the purposes of this project is going back to some of the sites that Ellen went to about 20 years ago, where she retrieved these ice cores. And these ice cores that have been documented, and you can get the data, it's publicly available, well documented and so on. And in my research project, we're going back to some of her sites and retrieving new ice cores to look at the changes that has occurred over this time. And it's just amazing to be able to walk a little bit in your footsteps for a bit, so very happy about that. So this lecture today is it's part of the Geography Seminar Series, and it's also selected by the Dean, the School of Arts Sciences Dean for Social and Behavioral Sciences, as a distinguished lecture, part of Dean Schroeder's special lecture series. So it's got some special honors to that. So with that, I will just stop this introduction and give Ellen the word to talk about her work in the Cryosphere about climate change. So, thank you for coming here.
Just getting organized. All right, well, thank you for the introduction. I've had a wonderful day here. Want to thank you for inviting me. I've never, believe it or not, I've never been to Rutgers. Alan, why didn't you invite me years ago?
I'm sorry.
No, it's been wonderful. And I'm very impressed with the students that I've met and the faculty I've met and the fine tour, etc. It's a special honor for me to actually be kind of on the same stage with Suki. I've known him for a number of years. He's one of those icons that I used to be one of the younger folks. I'm not now, but you know, we have admired Suki and his work for many years. Now, I'm not a modeler, so we're going to hear a little bit more about paleoclimatology and what we can learn from the ice. So past and contemporary climate change, evidence from Earth's cryosphere. And on the slide, you'll see 3 places. These are just 3 of the field sites that I've spent some time at over my career. Our team, I really want to point out, let me see if I can go forward. I want to point out that the work that I'm presenting represents the collective efforts of our research team, which consists of these senior people and our postdoctoral scholars. And then we currently have 2 graduate students, and acknowledge that our funding comes from NASA, NOAA, NSF, and we've received some funding in the past from the Comer Foundation. We appreciate that. So everybody knows that the Earth is warming. We only need to look at the data. And NASA and NOAA just had a joint announcement. NASA announcing that 2017 was the 2nd warmest year on record. NOAA, it came in 3rd. But the important thing when we look at this is that the last 4 years have actually been the warmest on record. And then we look over to the right, you can see the spatial distribution of the temperature trends from 1880 to 2017, and essentially showing that the globally average temperature of the planet has increased 1 degree centigrade. And for some of you, that may not seem like very much, but when you think about the difference between a glacial stage, such as when the ice was a mile thick over Columbus, Ohio, versus the type of climate that we've had in the Holocene, that temperature range is 5 to 6 degrees. And that puts this 1 degree warming into a different perspective. So, but the climate of the last 40 years has been remarkable. We've had this increased intensity and frequency of extreme weather. We've had heat waves in which tens of thousands of people have died. We've had prolonged droughts. As we've seen in California, droughts often are accompanied by fire and significant flooding around the planet. And the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change Models tell us that these type of system responses should be expected and that they will likely become more frequent. And I agree with what Suki said. You can't point to just one flood, one fire. You can't point to just one event and say, oh, that's global climate change. You have to look for the longer term patterns. All right, and so the record that I just showed you extends back to 1880, which is not very long, and it's important that we be able to put that into a longer context. And we do that by using paleoclimate records that come from these different archival systems. Ice cores, tree rings, corals, speleothems, ocean sediments, lake sediments, etc. But today, I'm just going to focus on ice cores. And actually, I'm going to focus not just on ice cores, but I'm going to focus on what's happening to the glaciers around the planet as well. It's important to remember that ice plays 3 key roles in the Earth system. It records the changes, and hence we get the paleoclimate records. Ice also drives or forces the climate system, and it also responds to changes in the system. Ice cores are powerful contributors to these multi-proxy reconstructions. They provide multiple lines of evidence. So, for example, from a single ice core, we can extract information about temperature, which we get from our oxygen and hydrogen isotopic ratios, atmospheric chemistry, major anions and cations, the net accumulation, where we have annual layers, such as you see here in this Tibetan ice core. We can reconstruct how much net precipitation minus evaporation or sublimation that we get, the dustiness of the atmosphere, vegetation changes, volcanic histories, and anthropogenic emissions. And one that I've left off, we now have a project looking at the microbial life, the microbes, the viruses, and the bacteria that are preserved as well. Oh, and I should just point out, let me just go back.
And the solar record, too.
That's true, and a record of solar activity. My list is going to get really long. And then for some of the cores, we're able to actually date these annually, either by looking at these visible layers, those are dust layers that are deposited here on the Tibetan Plateau during the non-monsoonal season, and then this is the monsoonal precipitation. So for some cores, we can actually date annually back several thousand years. Probably the most popular, or not popular, but the most well-known ice core record comes from the Dome C ice core in East Antarctica, and it covers 8 glacial interglacial cycles, goes back 800,000 years. And here, this is they call it the Antarctic temperature. It's actually derived from the stable water isotopes. And then the carbon dioxide concentration, that's interesting. I'm wondering if I've loaded the right presentation. Something's missing, but anyway, we'll go ahead. Anyway, so we get these gas records from the air that is trapped in these bubbles that you see. And one of the beauties of this is we can see that over a glacial interglacial cycle, the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere changes by about 100 parts per million. But when the Earth is in a warm phase, the concentration is around 280 to 300 parts per million. And when we're in a glacial stage, it's right around 200 parts per million. And it provides an interesting context for where we are today at about 205 parts per million. And you can see that at no time in the last almost 1 million years has CO2 concentration been as high as it is today. You actually have to go back about 3 million years to the Pliocene to attain to a time when CO2 was in excess of 400 ppm. And the other thing that's very important, and I know most of you in the audience know this, but the general public doesn't realize how long CO2 can stay in the atmosphere. And it can remain in the atmosphere for decades to millennia. So that makes this a really challenging problem for us. And just to point out, the Intergovernmental Panel greenhouse gas emissions scenarios suggest that if we stay on the same path we're on in terms of emissions, which is called the business as usual scenario, we could attain a concentration of 1,000 ppm at the end of the current century. And this slide really puts it into perspective. This is the decay curve for CO2. So CO2 emitted today, of the 100 units of CO2 emitted today, about a third of those will still be in the atmosphere 100 years from now. And 20% will still be in the atmosphere 1,000 years from now. So just to show you a few other things that we can glean from ice cores, this is a composite of what's called the, now I know I didn't load the right presentation, so I hope you all are forgiving. This is the non-volcanic excess sulfate. It's a composite from 5 cores over the Greenland ice sheet. And notice that we get the increase here around the turn of the 20th century, into the 20th century. I like this because I call it kind of a good news slide. And that is, you can see that the flux of, essentially think of it as anthropogenic sulfate, is declining, or began to decline around 1970 in response to the Clean Air Act. We can also measure in the same 5 ice cores the nitrate concentration, and we notice that just after the World War II, the increase in nitrate that tracks the increased use of fertilizer associated with the Green Revolution, and also the increase in the number of vehicles. Oh, it may not be too bad. It's not, Maybe it's just a slightly earlier version. So in order to measure all of the things, I told you how wonderful ice cores are. Essentially anything that falls out on the glacier and is preserved, you can go back when you drill a core, you have that record. And so, but to extract the record, you have to have the proper facilities. So at Ohio State, we have a Class 100 clean room, which is shown here. And then I've just shown you some of the different pieces of equipment, ion chromatograph. This is our Picaro for the ice-stable isotopes. This SP2 measures black carbon. This Coulter counter for dust. And this is an ICP-MS for trace elements. And then, of course, if you're in the ice core business, you have to have freezers. So this is the big freezer that's stuck on the back of our building at Ohio State. But then in here you can see that there's two big freezers. We have 7,000 1-meter lengths of core in storage, and these come from all the different cores that our team has drilled over the years. And then finally, we have a machine shop because we're one of the few groups that actually drill our own. We design, fabricate, and then run our own drills rather than getting that from a service. So this shows all the different cores that our team has drilled, or all the different sites. Usually, if it's possible, we drill more than one core at each site. And first thing I'm going to do, I'm going to jump right in with some examples. Let's see here. We're going to go to the Quelccaya ice cap. That's probably familiar to some of you. It's in the southern Andes of Peru, right here. And so it's the largest ice cap outside the polar regions. And so I like this slide. It's got the horses in the foreground. This is how you get your gear into that site. One of the beauties of the Quelccaya is that it's annually laminated. It also has a monsoonal climate, just like we have in the Himalaya. So these are annual layers. And when you're drilling the core and pulling the core out, you can actually date the core just as you're drilling it, which is unusual when you're used to working in the polar regions, because when you pull up a polar core, you don't see anything. It's just, it's just a stick of ice, and you don't know what you've got till you get home and you make all of the analytical measurements. I like to use this slide to show you how we date the cores in general. It's different from site to site, but not that much different. In most places we drill, we get a seasonal cycle in the stable isotopes. So here's the oxygen isotopic ratio showing you the summer and the winter variations. And then the dust concentration, you saw the dust layers. That's exactly, we're measuring them now though, using a Coulter counter. So we can literally just count these years back. Now in the next slide, I'm going to show you another 4-meter section from the core, but we're going to be deeper. And so what you see now, see we've moved down, and this is a section from 1560 to 1520, but you still see we have the nicely preserved seasonal variations in both the dust and in the isotopes. One of the things that I mentioned that we always try to take multiple cores, sometimes that's not possible. We had the opportunity to go back and re-drill the Quelccaya ice cap. It's such a unique record. It provided the first evidence of the Little Ice Age in South America, in the Andes. The first time we drilled the Quelccaya ice cap was in 1983. We were able to go back 20 years later and drill 2 cores, one on the North Dome and one on the Summit Dome. What I want to point out here, I want you to see, is the reproducibility. So these are the stable isotopes, or this is the Delta O18, showing temperature. And so this is the Little Ice Age here. And then because we're able to discern the annual layers, we can also then reconstruct the accumulation. We can look at when we had more or less precipitation. Now what's interesting here, and I'll make a few points that I'll come back to in the talk, is that in the early part of the Little Ice Age period here, notice that the accumulation was well above average, but the latter half of the Little Ice Age period, the accumulation was below average, the long-term average. But I also want to point out to you that today these ice fields are receiving an above-average accumulation. Although they're shrinking and they're thinning, and this is happening throughout the tropics and the subtropics, we'll look at some evidence for that, they are not shrinking because of the lack of precipitation. They're shrinking because the upper atmosphere, where these high elevation ice caps sit, is warming. One of the beauties of working in a place like South America is that there's a long archaeological history. And it's, we love ourselves. We're humans. We think we're wonderful, and we want to know more about ourselves. So, it's just, our history fascinates us. And one of the nice things about working in the areas with here is that we have the ice core record, which tells us about the climate and the environment, but we have the archaeological history as well. So it's well known that over multi-decadal time scales and to century time scales, that there is a bimodal distribution of precipitation in the Andes. And that is when we're getting a lot of precipitation in the highlands, the coastal regions tend to be dry. And so if we just go back to like around 400 to 600 AD, in the Quelccaya ice cap record, and let's just focus on this one, which is our accumulation, you can see that it was dry in the highlands, and at the same time we had these well-developed coastal cultures, such as the Mochi culture here. But then the highlands become wet. The coastal cultures seem to disappear, and the highland cultures emerge, the Tiwanaku and the Huari cultures. And then Quelccaya tells us that the highland got dry, and we see the highland cultures dissipating, and now we've got the rise of the Timor coastal culture. I think you're getting the picture. And then entering into the early part of the Little Ice Age, again, it was very moist, and we had the rise of the Inca Empire in the highlands. But that was terminated in 1532 with the arrival of the Spanish. So what I wanted to point out is that now today we have the precipitation is higher in the highlands. We all know that the Peruvian coast is a desert. We grow asparagus there. Doesn't make a lot of sense, but we do that with water that comes from the highlands. And where do the people live in Peru now? Almost all of them live on the coast. So that tells you that they were maladapted at this point. But these early cultures were very adapted to and adapted well to the change. So just to show you some of the changes, the Quelccaya ice cap, we've looked at that. That photo was taken in 1977. This is a photo from exactly the same location taken in 2002. So you can already see what's happening to the glaciers there. Now, it's possible that nature's best thermometer, or perhaps its most sensitive and unambiguous indicator of climate change, could be ice. I mean, you can go to, you can go like to the Senate and talk to our congressional people and talk about isotopes and show them the data, and the eyes glaze over. But if you show them photographs of what the response of ice, they get that. Henry Pollack published a book in 2009 called A World Without Ice. And ice asks no questions, presents no arguments, reads no newspapers, listens to no debates. It's not burdened by ideology and carries no political baggage as it changes from solid to liquid. It just melts. Just a physical system that responds to its environment. Now we can look at how ice has changed, and we're going to focus here in the Andes. And we can use many different tools. One of the most interesting, I think, is repeat photography. But these photographs are very hard to find. This is a this is a photo that was taken back in the 30s by a very well-known Peruvian photographer. This is actually the photo of a festival that is held outside of Cusco every year, and they go up to praise the ice and thank the ice. And in the 30s, they would take a chip of the ice and take it home because it was considered very sacred. It's a place called Collariti. Our team was able to find the exact same location and take this photograph in 2006. And when you superimpose them, you can see how the glaciers have retreated up valley, but you can also see how they've down-wasted. And you are not allowed, they still have the ceremony every year, but you are no longer allowed to take any ice away. Of course, we have more sophisticated ways, such as instruments that are borne by satellites. This is a Landsat 5 image taken in 1988. This is the work of Compton Tucker at NASA. This is the Cordillera Vilcanota. This is the Quelccaya ice cap, this entire complex. And then in 2006, another Landsat 5, and then superimposed. Everywhere you see yellow, the ice was gone by 2006. The Cordillera Vilcanota had lost 24% of its ice coverage, and the Quelccaya ice cap had lost 14%. At this time, it covered 45 square kilometers, and now it covers 41. We can also, again with repeat photography, this is the Coricalis Glacier, the largest outlet glacier on Quelccaya, as it appeared in 1978, and then it's going to change into a 2011 image. So it's retreated, leaving this glacial lake that covers about, I think it's 84 acres, and it's 200 feet deep. Now, there are other ways that we can put this change of the Quelccaya into perspective. This is the 1977 image. Here are two people carrying something up to the summit, probably a drill stem. All of this ice is now gone. In a few slides, you're going to see a lake. This is all a lake now. But I wanted to come down here and show you this about a 30-meter high wall. Here's a person for scale. This wall is actually back in here now. And while we were waiting for the horses to arrive, Lonnie took a walk out along the wall, and he found this plant deposit right here. This is a wetland plant. We collected it, brought it back, had it identified. It's called Distichia muscoides. The thing about a wetland plant is it doesn't have any woody tissue. So this means that once it's exposed to the atmosphere, it's going to dry very quickly. It'll disintegrate, and the wind will literally blow it away. This is that plant deposit. Our Quelccaya plant was dated, radiocarbon dated at 5,200 years. And so that means that this plant was overrun 5,200 years ago when the Quelccaya ice cap was actually expanding. The other thing I want you to notice is the distance between the wall, the ice wall here, and this plant deposit. And this is just 3 years later, 2005. Here's the plant deposit dried up. This is what I mean. These wetland plants, the minute they're exposed, they start with decay. But you can see how far back the Quelccaya has retreated in just 3 years. Since subsequently, we've collected numerous plants. And so in 2011, we collected 5 plants on this side of the lake. This is that lake that formed when that ice ramp, as that ice ramp melted. These 5 plants over here are dated at 6,300 years. We have about 20 plant samples collected over here between 2004 and 2007 that date around 4,700 years. So that's a 1,600-year difference. And what that tells us is that it took this ice 1,600 years to advance from here to here. And from our photography, we've been to Quelccaya 24 times, and always come back to this area. This retreat took 25 years. So a very slow advance and a very rapid retreat. And that's what's happening to glaciers around the world. We just had a paper out last year in JGR Atmospheres looking at, now I know this is not my most recent version. Just be forgiving, please. So essentially the thesis of the paper is that these impacts of the recent warming, this recent warming, particularly in the mid-troposphere, at about 500 millibars, has really taken a toll on these glaciers. And also, the 2015-16 El Nino had a strong impact on the tropical Peruvian ice fields. So just the take-home message is this mid-tropospheric warming in the Peruvian Andes is actually destroying the climate signals that are preserved in the glaciers, and they're driving glacier retreat. And I'll show you the reasons we can say that in the next slide. And also we'll look at the impact of the 2015-16 El Nino on Quelccaya, and that it was more pronounced than for previous events. And also in the paper we talk about how the delta O18 of the snow is linked to the tropical SSTs, 500 millibar temperatures, as well as to the intensity of convection. I mentioned the fact that we'd been able to go back to Quelccaya 24 times. So the first time in 1974, but that's another story. But here's 1976, 79, 83, 91. Every time that we've gone back, we take a shallow core, if we're not deep drilling, take a shallow core and excavate a pit. And so what you're seeing here, this is depth, and the shaded in gray is the most recent year of accumulation. You notice the beautiful seasonal signal in the stable isotopes. I've shown you that before. Notice that as we come forward, we're now at 1991, it's not being preserved at depth. Do you notice that? In 2016, we virtually got 2 years. That was it, and that seasonal signal has been removed. It's not removed at depth, but it's removed in the upper fern layer. So we're losing the modern record. In addition, we had the opportunity, we were there in 2016. Notice that the accumulation on Quelccaya was cut to about a third. In addition, this is the precipitation, the isotopic composition of the precipitation during that El Nino. Notice that we don't get any seasonal signal. And you go back to the 82, 83 El Nino, didn't affect the accumulation much, but it certainly affected the seasonal signal. But if you go to the north, to Huascarán, where we actually drilled in 1993 to bedrock, we went back in 2016, the same year. Here's the core, the 10-meter core. Notice that we've got the nice seasonal signal, and the impact of the El Nino is much less on the accumulation. And so, but Huascarán, which contains a record that goes back 19,000 years, we know that from the 1993 core that we drilled, so it's been in place for 19,000 years. Huascarán is almost 400 meters higher than Quelccaya. And what this tells us is today, Huascarán is not being significantly affected by this mid-tropospheric warming that's happening in the lower latitudes. Essentially, our hypothesis is that Huascarán, which is in the Cordillera Blanca, may be the last Peruvian glacier that's preserving an unaltered climate history. We've looked at many of the glaciers throughout the Andes here. They're all of the same, pretty much the same elevation as Quelccaya, but it seems now to get a preserved climate signal of today, you have to go higher. But Huascarán is the highest tropical glacier. All right, now I want to go to the Arctic, a place where we're also seeing large and fast changes. This shows you the average ice extent in September from 1979 to 2017. Of course, there's up and down. There's always variability. And wanted to point out the 2012, which was the minimum, And that also was contemporaneous with the very large melt event that occurred in Greenland. So these are the cumulative melt days. This is the work of Tom Mote. This would be almost your 30-year mean. Notice that you have very few melt days up on the plateau. The elevation up here is around 3,000 meters. And for the average, you're getting your summer melt just along the southern coastal margins. And this pretty much ties into what you see here in blue in terms of the percent of melt extent. But in red, and over here, we have the number of melt days. And this is the total number of melt days for 2012. You can see that along the coast, you're getting melt almost everywhere along the periphery, even melt up in the summit area. And some places are getting over 100 days with some surface melt. This is not melting of the Greenland ice sheet. This is melting of the Greenland ice sheet surface. So you have to be careful when you think about that. Also here we see the melt extent up to 90% in July of the ice sheet surface was experiencing some degree of melt. And of course then that produces the water that runs across the surface, runs into the moulins. You can see the melt ponds and the rivers, little rivers that connect the melt ponds there. And I did want to say that Osa and her team are doing a lot of this work. This is everybody who, well, let me just say, this is a very well-known graphic showing the lakes that form, the moulins, the possibility of some basal lubrication, crevasses. When the surface water runs into the crevasses, it actually transports heat into the glacier. But now we know also that we have aquifers that are collecting water, and just below the surface in the fern zone, your work. Much of a portion of this water is actually refreezing at depth, well, at some depth, but in the near surface, so that you cannot measure the amount of melt that you measure on, you cannot take the amount of melt that you measure on the ice sheet surface and say, oh, this volume of water melted on the Greenland ice sheet, such and such. Oh, and that is all going to go into the ocean and raise sea level. So the ice sheet retains some of that meltwater. So Suki had talked about interhemispheric differences, changes, and the changes in sea ice extent between the Arctic and the Antarctic are quite different. So this essentially is an image taken on January the 14th. First, up here in orange, that was in 2015. That was the maximum extent on January the 14th. That occurred in 2015. And then the minimum extent occurred in 2017, January 14th. We look over here, I want you to focus on this. This shows the ice extent from 2007 to 2018. What you see in Antarctica, around Antarctica with the sea ice, is you don't really see any type of persistent trend, at least since 2007. And in fact, this is the year of the maximum sea ice extent was 2015. This is 2017. This little dot's just a few days into January of this year. But really no significant trend. A few years ago, we heard, and Suki was talking about the fact that it appeared that the ice extent around Antarctica was expanding, but right now it's declining. So we know that the Antarctic ice sheet is warming, and the continent by about 1/10 of a degree C per decade. And the mass loss from Antarctica is accelerating. The West Antarctic ice sheet, which is inherently unstable, contains 5 to 6 meters of sea level rise equivalent. Over in East Antarctica, very stable part of the ice sheet, 60 meters of sea level rise equivalent. There were two papers that came out in 2014. one in Geophysical Research Letters, one in Science, talking about this area, which is called the Ross Embayment, and the fact that the Pine Island Glacier, the Thwaites Glacier, some of these other glaciers have the potential to drain a lot of ice in this area. And there's concern that if the ice shelves in here break up, that these ice streams can flow more easily into the ocean. The studies concluded that there was that the West Antarctic ice sheet appears to be in an irreversible state of decline, with nothing to stop the glaciers in the area from melting into the sea. They've got a lot of press for that. So we know that global sea level is rising, and in the early part of the record, 1870 to 1924, rising about 1 millimeter a year, then picking up around 1925 to 92, about 2 millimeters a year. And it's generally thought that what's kicking in here is the melt of these high elevation, the alpine glaciers. And then since 1993, of course, the data are better for sure. Sea level's rising around 3 millimeters a year, and it's thought that this is where the Greenland ice sheet has really begun to kick in, contributing water to the ocean. I thought I would just show you quickly one project that we had in 2009-10 as part of the International Polar Year. And Suki had talked about the Drake Passage and the Antarctic Peninsula. I want to point out the Bellingshausen Sea here. It's the one area around Antarctica when the sea ice was actually on average expanding. The Bellingshausen Sea ice has not been expanding and has actually been declining. So looking at the peninsula, we drilled an ice core to bedrock at this location called Bruce Plateau. There are not many ice cores from the peninsula, one from James Ross Island up here and one from Gomez at the base of the peninsula. Go back. This is our field camp here. This is the Bruce Plateau. We're looking out over the Amundsen Sea here. We were serviced by a fixed-wing aircraft with skis. This just shows you what a 6-person camp looks like. Very, very small, very efficient. All of our drilling occurred under this one dome. We have a short tower. We spent 42 days here and drilled 448 meters to bedrock. This is an example of the core. And the conditions were very harsh. The Antarctic Peninsula is probably one of the hardest places to work in Antarctica, and that is because of the circumpolar winds that Suki talked about. And so, for example, this is our camp looking out from the drill dome, and then just moments later, it'll look like that. So there's just constant drifting. You can see everything is drifted in. We're constantly having to dig ourselves out. So we had a paper in Journal of Climate. I'll just run over very quickly the results. I don't know if you've heard of the southern annular mode, but it's a major driver of the climate regime in the peninsula and in West Antarctica particularly. And it's a pressure difference between the 65 degrees south and 40 degrees south. And when that pressure gradient is very strong, the southern annular mode is considered in a positive mode. And recently, the peninsula's been receiving more than average accumulation, which is really good because the more accumulation you have, the easier it is to discern every year and then count the layers back, etc. Over the last 45 years, the accumulation has been positively correlated with the southern annular mode and with the Southern Oscillation Index, which is the atmospheric component of ENSO. But what we found is, and the people in our community were actually working on the assumption that the southern annular mode had been persistently positive. Well, what we found is there's a relationship between the relationship between the southern annular mode and the accumulation changed around the late 1940s and the mid-1970s. Show you quickly. So This is the Bruce Plateau accumulation shown in blue, and this is the southern annular mode, the Marshall reconstruction shown in black. And going back to 1970, we have a fairly strong positive relationship. But we noticed that prior to 1970, notice how it's now in antiphase? And when we did the correlation for the entire time series, the R value drops. Well, so what we did are 11-year running correlation coefficients shown in red between the SAM and the accumulation, and also between the accumulation and the southern oscillation. Well, what you notice is that the reason what's happened is we've had a shift in the relationship right here. That's what we're seeing here. And you notice now that the relationship between accumulation and the strength of the southern annular mode has changed sign. It's negative. And then around the late 40s, the positive relationship returns. And it actually ends up, a long story short, it seems to be primarily the phase of the Pacific decadal oscillation that is affecting the accumulation, both the strength of the southern of the, affecting the accumulation. So essentially what's happening is when SAM's influence is reduced, in other words, when that meridional pressure gradient weakens or is reduced, as is what happens when PDO is negative, the accumulation is now modulated more by tropical and subtropical processes. So rather than being that tight circumpolar vortex or the circumpolar winds that are contracted toward the continent, we're now getting a relaxation, and the circumpolar westerlies are moving more to the north. And essentially, this impacts the strength and position of these circumpolar westerlies moving more toward the equator. Also affects the South Pacific convergence zone. So essentially what's happening is we're getting the intrusion of climate processes from the lower latitudes. Well, what this essentially says is it's very important that we be able to test what we call our the conventional views. We see something and we think that it's stationary, when in reality, if we can look at a longer record, what we find is that the relationship often is not stationary. All right. And then just kind of head toward wrapping up, and again, I apologize. So let's move from the Antarctic Peninsula northward up to Indonesia, to the island of Papua, and I want to talk about the ice fields on Puncak Jaya. We have photographs. The oldest photograph goes back to 1936, 91, and 2001. You can see how the ice fields here are diminishing. And in 2010, our team, I was not there, but in 2010, our team drilled 3 cores from the last 2 remaining glaciers in Papua, Indonesia. This is the east north wall fern and the west north wall fern. Now, this is our drill camp. We're perched right there, had to be put in by helicopters. And we recovered ice cores. These are only 27-meter long ice cores. Unfortunately, we've not been able to get good time scales on them because these glaciers are actually down-wasting so fast. A colleague of mine in Australia, almost 40 years ago, told us almost 40 years ago that these glaciers were melting and we needed to get here and get those cores right now. Unfortunately, it took us about 40 years to muster everything that was required to go into New Guinea, essentially, and do this job. But I'll show you what's happening to the glaciers. This is the photo in 2010. That drill site that we saw was right here. And my animation, unfortunately, is not running. I had an animation, but let's go back. This is what it looked like in 2010, and here's the photograph from 2016. And when our team was there in 2010, they camped here because all of this was filled with ice, and they walked up here and drilled each day. So these glaciers are disappearing. What's interesting is that if we plot the total ice area for Puncak Jaya, or for those ice fields in Papua, as well as the retreat or the size of the Kilimanjaro ice fields from the early part of the 20th century, you can see what's happening to the glaciers. And these two glaciers or these two ice fields are of about the order at one time about the same size. They're both down to around 2 square kilometers now. So this is what's happening around the globe. Now, we talk about the polar regions. We think of Antarctica and the Arctic or Greenland, but there's actually a third pole, and that is this complex that sits on the Tibetan Plateau and encompasses the Himalaya. Just like the Arctic and the Antarctic, this third pole is high, it's cold, it's remote, and it's also threatened by climate change. Covers about 5 million square kilometers, and is one of the largest glacial stores of fresh water. It's often called Asia's water tower. It also feeds Asia's largest rivers and helps sustain about 1.5 billion people. These are the major rivers here. Here's the Indus, the Brahmaputra, and the Ganges. And I want to just take you one place, and that's this glacier right here that's called Nanunami. This is Gurla Mundata, very well-known, beautiful place. You go up the valley here, and you come out on this ice field. And in 2006, our team recovered 3 ice cores to bedrock, the deepest 160 meters. Well, we had a problem dating this core too, and I'll show you why. We used the radioactive fallout from thermonuclear testing as time horizons that allow us to have known time points or time points in the ice fields. This is the beta radioactivity in the 5 of the 6 ice, or 5 of the ice, we've only drilled 5, so the 5 ice cores we've drilled in Tibet. And this is the 1962-63 beta horizon associated with thermonuclear testing, and we didn't find it in Nanunami. What that means is that the snow that was deposited on Nanunami in 1962 doesn't exist. It's not there. So then we thought, oh, this is really terrible. And so then we looked deeper for the chlorine-36 spike that's associated with the Ivy tests. And that's found around the world. In Bolivia, in China, Kilimanjaro, Huascaran, Gayatri, Greenland, in the Alps. But on Nanunami, it's not there. And that means when we were there drilling in 2006, that upper surface was not modern. And it predates 1950. So we have a real problem here with the tie points on dating the core. When we've published, we've got a publication, but actually talking about what we call the decapitation of these high elevation glaciers. And this is what's happening to the glaciers around the third pole. This shows the area reduction for 7,000, roughly 7,000 glaciers in 7 different areas. The larger the circle, the larger the annual change in the area, the change in the area. Red's negative. The only place where the glaciers in Tibet appear to be expanding or fairly stagnant is up here in the northwest. And in fact, they're just in the New York Times. Maybe some of you saw about the two avalanches that occurred. If you didn't talk about it later if you're interested, but that occurred up here. So essentially, what's happening is we've got this amplification of the warming at high elevation. So we talk about the IPCC models tell us that the projected warming for 2100 might be on the order of a range of 2 to 5, maybe 2.5 to 5 degrees C of the Earth's surface. Of course, we're hoping for 1.5. It's probably a false hope. 2 might be possible. But we're getting amplification of that warming at high elevation. And this comes from the IPCC fourth assessment under what's called business as usual, with CO2 at about 800 ppm. Now what we've plotted here at height with elevation are all of these different glaciers, some of which I've talked about, some of which I haven't had time to talk about. But the thing to notice is that the projected warming at 500 millibar level, roughly, where these glaciers exist, is on the order of 5 degrees C. So we shouldn't really be shocked that we're losing these glaciers in the tropics and the subtropics around the world. And I'm going to wrap it up there. And just want to remind you that for global climate change, nature really is the timekeeper, and we're not quite smart enough yet to see the clock. And I think if we could see the clock, we might still not be smart enough to do the things we need to do. But, we have to be hopeful. And that's it. And I really apologize for that, the big mistake of loading the wrong slide. I won't get over that for a very long time.
Okay, I think we'll be take maybe a question or two. Anybody? Yes, Yerk.
Ellen, great talk, and 2 talks that actually benefited. But on the Calcaya, we see expansion of the ice sheet around 6 to 4.5 kilometers, which I think has to do with the neoglaciation. What is it? I mean, you see it in the south, you see it in the tropics, you see it in the north. You've been puzzled. Why is it symmetric over, the whole, both hemispheres? What do you think is the driving it?
You're talking about the glacial advance?
Yeah.
Like the Holocene advance.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I see that's after
Right.
the mid-Holocene warms, and we see it in the north, we see it in New Zealand. I mean, do you have any explanation why is it global rather than anti-symmetric between the hemispheres?
Well, I don't really know. We don't have that much evidence other than, for this, just talking about the south. We don't have many ice core records for the south. But we do, the northern hemisphere and the tropical glaciers tend to show that. I mean, Kilimanjaro also showed that. I don't know, but we did have, if you look at the Holocene, the early Holocene is relatively warm. Then we get that cooling, and it kind of accelerates around 5,000 to 6,000 years ago. I don't know. I'm wondering if it might have to do with solar radiation, some change in solar radiation. I mean, those are longer cycles. But I know over that time period, the intertropical convergence zone was moving. So, I mean, I think it could have to do with the intertropical convergence zone. And the only thing I can think that would drive that would have to be radiation. I don't know if other people have other ideas. But it is it's very interesting. It's a robust observation, there's no doubt about that. Yeah.
So I'm curious about your comment. Maybe this is the obvious, but you said, well, when you go higher, you see that there is less perturbation in the upper part of the glacier. And so that shouldn't disturb me really, because you're going higher, it's colder. But what disturbs me is trying to put that into perspective of how much ice you've lost lower, which I wonder, when you think about radiative balances, the radiative balance can't be that much different over that difference in altitude, but the melt rate is hugely big.
Right. Well, so for Calcaya, my answer is going to be the what you would call the freezing level altitude is actually rising. This Quelccaya is a dome-shaped glacier, and so it makes it very sensitive to any type of, just a slight rise in the freezing level. You're affecting a large volume of that ice field.
I guess I
And-
wondered what's causing that. Is it purely carbon dioxide related radiation, or is it water vapor?
Oh, water vapor. Water
Yeah.
vapor is critical.
Yeah, that's what I guess
Critical.
I'm asking.
I mean,
It's water
people
vapor.
tend to forget, and I should have highlighted that, it's our most important greenhouse gas, and it's a slave to temperature.
Right. So those differences
Oh.
in altitude could be differences in water vapor. That's my.
But probably that's driven by they go in pretty much in lockstep. You raise the temperature, you get the more, yes. Mhm.
That glacier that you said was decapitated, is
Yeah.
it possible that it melted at the surface and the water percolated down and sort of washed out the signal from the radioactive?
No, if it did, we would know it, because when you have melting, the melted ice is very easy to distinguish from ice that has not melted, because the ice that has gone through the typical, what you call fernification, densification process, has air bubbles in it. And it's glassy looking, but when you've had percolation, there are no bubbles. When you have melt, the bubbles are gone. So when you see bubble-free ice, you look at bubble-free ice all the time, then you know that you've got melting. So this is the same question we got when we had exactly the same problem on Kilimanjaro. When we drilled there, and we brought the core home, we did not find that upper beta with the 62, 63, 64 horizon was absent. We were lucky. The chlorine 36 spike in 52, 53 was there. So when we were drilling there, we were drilling the 53 surface in 2000. But going back through the core, there were no other instances of melt, which was surprising to us, being that it's so close. It sits virtually on the equator. Yeah, but it's very easy to tell if you've had melting just by the physical properties. Any other questions? All right. It must be dear